Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
No Place Like the Morgue, Volume 2, Story Number 1. I have a few, but here are one of my favorite stories. I worked trauma ICU for years. As you can imagine, we saw horrific and heartbreaking situations. We saw many deaths that were unexpected. I worked night shift mostly. On this occasion, it was a middle-aged woman who was run over by a train. Surgery was attempted, but she ultimately succumbed to her injuries when she was in ICU. My co-workers and I were doing post-mortem care. We were cleaning her up the best we could before bagging the body to take her down to the morgue. This room had large windows, and I remember looking outside to the city skyline as my co-worker was tying on the toe tag. There was a figure standing between us in the window reflection. I remember blinking a few times, thinking maybe my eyes were misinterpreting the reflection of my co-worker and me, but there she was, a woman that looked just like the patient standing in between us. She was moving her shoulders like she was sobbing. My coworker noticed me looking out the window and looked to herself. I could also see her blinking, trying to make sense of what she saw. We then turned to each other as if to see if we could see something physically standing between us. We saw nothing and turned back to the window reflection. The figure was gone. We took a break in post-mortem care after that. Can you blame us? Next story. I spent 10 years assisting in autopsies at an upstate New York hospital that was attached to an old convent connected to the hospitals by a passageway and several tunnels. First red flag, but I was young. I was on call most of the time because a forensic pathologist would travel, so I would get calls to do autopsies at 9, 10 at night. One night I got a call to meet said doctor in the morgue and get everything ready. As I'm walking to the morgue, in the basement of course, I come around a corner and saw a man hunched in the corner, hammering at something. I stopped. He turned to look at me, smiled, and nodded his head and then disappeared. I wasn't terrified because I didn't feel any negative energy. But talk to me about doing autopsies on inmates, and I'll tell you there is so much negative energy. It's absolutely palpable. Next story. I was hired as an overnight resident counselor. The house was a large brownstone, very old, but kept in good condition. I noticed that when I went in for the first shift, other coworkers looked at me like, good luck. I happened to be doing the client's laundry. The machines were off the kitchen. I walked out to the kitchen table, and out of the corner of my eye saw a very large, full-body man dressed in an orange jumpsuit. It scared the shit out of me, and he just nodded his head and disappeared. The next shift, I walked into the front parlor, same time around 4 a.m. I saw a well-dressed older man with a briefcase floating down the stairs. When he saw me, he looked as scared as I was, and disappeared. Saw a few more until I decided I would ask our nurse and manager. When I told them the above, they looked at me and the nurse asked if I knew what the house was prior to the home for our clients. I said no. The manager told me that she had had extreme difficulty keeping staff because the house was a former funeral home. Also, there was a murder of an overnight worker. Her ex-boyfriend came to the house and wanted to talk to her. She let him in. He murdered her and dumped her body across the street in a wooded area. The man in the orange jumpsuit was her boyfriend in his prison jumpsuit. The other men were owners of the funeral home. That bastard attached himself to me and I brought him home with me. My older daughter, 8 years old, saw him in our living room. I yelled him to leave and never come back. I saged the house and did a salt ritual. I asked for a transfer to another group home. This happened in Cohoes, New York, Mohawk Street murder. Never went back to that house, and I'm sure you understand why. Next story. I teach interpersonal communication and had a night class at a university. My cat died weeks before and was raising Cain with turning the lights off and on at the house, showing up in photographs that I took on my digital camera, etc. She obviously wanted me to know she was still around. We were very close. She was very important to me. That night, the students were in pairs discussing a topic while I went around the room photographing them for nonverbal communication observation, such as raised eyebrows, hand gesticulation, etc. I loaded up my photos to the computer and showed them the photographs on a large overhead screen. For the second half of the class interpreted the nonverbal communication I took of the pairs, and then the pair in the photograph gave the class feedback as to how correct the interpretation was. We had done about 7 pairs when a student said, "Excuse me, professor, but there's a cat in the window on that photograph." Several other students nodded, as they had also seen it. The rest of the class had focused on the window instead of the students in the photos, and sure enough, there was my cat, sitting outside the window of a second floor classroom. Everyone sighed and agreed it was a cat. It was sitting like she was on the ground, but she was actually outside a second floor window. Next story. My mom used to be a CNA at a facility for those with special needs and those who have acute care needs. The facility was decades old. My mom used to work on the new, at the time, children's unit. Sometimes she floated to where the long-term patients were. Near the long-term patients area, you could go outside and access the main lobby from behind that area that had all the HVAC stuff and whatnot. Boilers, you name it. Near those rooms was access to an elevator. The elevator went to a defunct and abandoned portion of the facility that was the old children's unit back in the earlier 1900s. Security guards avoided going into that area behind the lobby and near the exit at all costs because it freaked everyone out. As a kid, I passed by it once or twice, and I've never seen an elevator look so ominous. I could swear that Silent Hill 4, the room, took inspiration from it because it just gave off some weird vibes. My mom and a few of her coworkers told me that sometimes it smelled like baby powder in that corridor, and other times it smelled like a fire, as if wood were burning. There was an incident there decades ago that killed a few of the children residents from a small fire. My mother was asked to grab an item from that corridor on a random night. Pretty sure it was some old document in a file box. Not keen on the why, she was a bit apprehensive as again, the whole area just seemed completely off. There was no lighting in the room aside from the elevator opening and closing. She told me that the elevators would only work half the time, and when they worked, the doors opening up always smelled like something was burning. She got the files she needed and told me she was stuck around for about 10 minutes before the elevator decided to work. She pressed the button and the elevator was just unresponsive. The crazy part is that she told me there was a phone ringing in the room. Not a modern day phone, but one of those old rotary ones from decades long past. She told me she answered the phone and only heard static and something indistinguishable. You couldn't really make out what was being said, but it definitely wasn't all static. She went on the elevator and everyone downstairs could hear the phone still ringing. Maintenance and facilities went into a panic. Allegedly, there was no electricity in that room as it had been gutted. Breakers were off and nothing should have been active. That shouldn't have been possible since, barring the elevator, that room had been without electricity for 20 years and people didn't even know the ringing they heard was a phone upstairs. Simply because it never happened. Next story. I'm a psych award worker and I was working the night shift and it was roughly 4 a.m. I was on a patient's observation and I sat at the bedroom door. This patient was high risk, so required constant observation even when asleep. The bedroom is one of 10 located on a corridor and roughly halfway down it. At one end is the nurse's station and the other is an airlock used to enter or leave the ward. This night I was on my own on the corridor as no other patients required constant observation. I remember looking up the corridor to the airlock door, which had a glass window strip built into it, and seeing a very tall, skinny, pitch black figure on the other side of the door, as if it were looking down the corridor. I was silently waiting for whoever was at the other side of the door to come through, thinking it may have been a colleague, but it just stayed there, not moving. A bit disturbed at this point, I radioed for assistance from a colleague, but when I looked back up from the radio, the figure was gone. When my colleague arrived, They took over from me so I could go and check if there was someone stuck in between the two doors of the airlock, but there was nothing. No one. Through the airlock is a 24-hour reception, so I checked with them if anyone had come through, and there had not been anyone. One of many creepy experiences myself and colleagues have had there. Next story. I work in a dementia and elderly nursing home, and it's a relatively new building, built back in 2016. I've worked there since 2020, and there have been numerous odd things. One thing being we had a lady who always liked to sit on one specific seat in the lounge, and during the night would wander into one specific lady's room and sit in her chair watching her sleep. We also had wall lights with independent bulbs spread out across the room. After the lady passed, we started having issues where only the light above her chair in the lounge would light up, and this happened on a consistent basis until the room was rearranged to suit new residents' need. Also, the lady she used to watch sleep at night randomly woke up one night, looking over at her chair, talking to the chair with nobody in it. Another instance was that we had a lady in the room who used to walk around appearing worried and often crying. After she died, we had a man come in and move into her room. He had dementia, but without hallucinations, and it was in its early stages. One morning I asked him how he slept, and he said, "Not good. There's always a lady crying in here." Some of my colleagues experienced things as well, but I can't remember all of them. I do remember one of my colleagues shocked one day because she was sitting at her desk and her pot of coffee moved on the desk by itself right in front of her. She swears her window wasn't open, and it was out of her reach. Next story. I work in a nursing home, night shifts, and I didn't really believe in the paranormal before this because I always thought things had a rational explanation. But boy, was I wrong. One example that happened quite recently was a person passed away, and the person moving in the room afterwards complained about a person disturbing them when they were sleeping. I asked this person who they meant, and they told me that they don't know this person, but that he or she always stands by the bed or in the hallway just looking at me. I asked if they could describe this person, knowing that it's impossible for someone to enter another's apartment because the doors are locked, so only the attendant can enter or exit. And then they perfectly described the previous attendant, how this person looked a few months before their health declined, leading to their passing. I got some big chills when I heard a description, and later on a coworker came in on their day off to cleanse the room. Next story. I worked on a floor with delicate patients who could go south quickly, so patients passing weren't too uncommon, unfortunately. One of my patients passed away from a large pulmonary embolism, and the room was empty the remainder of the weekend. We heard coughing coming from that room all weekend. Early in the morning, at change of shift, I was walking into my patient's room for rounding, and the bathroom door was ajar as I walked in. After checking on my patient, I was about to close the door behind me, but did my usual turn around to see if anything was out of place, and the bathroom door closed shut. There was no AC on, no draft, no family member, nada. No reason for it to have closed. It wasn't fast, like aggressive, but swift, like purposeful, if that makes any sense. A night shift co-worker of mine talked about a night when a patient's multiple get well cards taped to their wall suddenly fell onto the ground for no reason, like a breeze had come through. We also had a cursed room where multiple patients had passed in it in a year span. I've had patients who were confused, asked me who the person was behind me, or if the person in the corner could leave. Those always made my skin crawl. Next story. One of the older janitors at my job, he was working graveyard shift and was in the basement near the morgue mopping around 4 a.m. The basement is not a patient area, so there are no patients down there. Anyway, he turned around and saw a patient who was an old man with an IV pole, but it was the old-fashioned glass bottle IV, and he was wearing a hospital gown that was white and not our normal hospital gown pattern. He waved at the man, then went back to mopping. Then he thought maybe the patient was lost and turned back around to help him, but the man was gone, with just a small cloud of smoke where he had been. Also, my mom was a nurse in the late 60s, early 70s, when she was worming the neuro ward. She covered for a friend in a room with a man who had a terrible brain disease. Actually, he was young and dying, decompensating mentally, but not restrained. He smashed his IV bottle and held it to my mom's throat when she had her back turned for a moment. She just stood there with him crying and moaning in a headlock with a broken glass bottle, dripping blood and saline on her uniform. She was found in the room with a man when she was late meeting up with another pal for coffee. They called, "Jean, are you okay?" And she said, "We're fine, but call security." That's when they looked in the door and saw this. Somehow security guard got him back into bed and my mom finally collapsed. She said they also had two glass bottles of disinfectant. Really glad it wasn't Lysol instead. She tried to go back after that, but instead insisted on working in the cardiac unit. I'm sure you can understand why. Next story. I started working in a new care home on nights. I was given the job to check the top floor alone. It was horrible. There were mirrors everywhere for some creepy reason. Anyway, I was alone, not a single patient knew my name, as they were all asleep when I started. Yet constantly I was hearing my name being whispered. The worst part was, because of the mirrors, you could see everything, and I was terrified of looking because I thought something would be behind me. I could feel and hear something behind me but saw nothing. Another time I heard whistling behind me but no one was there. Another time I was in a patient's room and she said, "Why is there a man just standing behind you, not saying anything?" She wasn't delusional or had dementia. She was one of our most sane patients. That place was full of dark energy. I wore my cross necklace every shift for safety. Next story. I was a nurse working night shift. As I walked down the dim empty hall, I heard the click tick of an IV machine. The machine made this sound when it was on hold, and the sound ticked only so long until it timed out. Then it shrilled a louder beep. Anyway, I heard this sound coming from an empty room. I thought a patient may have wandered into an empty room being sleepy or confused. I opened the door wider to the room, and the sound was louder, but definitely coming from the closed bathroom door. I opened the bathroom door only to find it empty, but felt a whoosh as if someone quickly passed by me. I felt like it was offended. Thing is, that particular IV and the sound of it was no longer in use. The hospital now had new IV machines, and the sound was different. Next story. I was towards the back of the unit and working on the night shift. I was on the rolling computer in the hallway, and it was dark because the lights are dimmed automatically after 10 p.m. The only light that illuminated my surroundings was the glow from my computer screen. I was standing outside a room charting something, and from the glow of my computer, coming from my right, I saw a patient walking towards me. Gown, grippy socks, and all. Fairly tall female, bobbed haircut, and they were dragging an IV pole. I saw this peripherally, so I looked up to greet them, but it was just an empty hallway. They came less than 15 feet from me. I should have heard the IV pole wheels, but I didn't. Fast forward maybe a week or two later. Same hallway, night shift, but I was walking on that hallway to get something from the kitchen. This time, the nurse's station was behind me, so that was a light source down the dark hallway. I was looking straight ahead when movement caught my eye. I saw just the lower half of a patient walking from left to right. Hospital gown, grippy socks. Saw it take a few steps before it walked into a wall. I was in denial too, and chalked it up to being tired, even though I knew better. Next story. I used to work for a local funeral home, and I think it's something that just comes to be expected there. We would have doors opening and closing at random times, lights that would be turned off, and a few minutes later they'd be back on again. We had a few spirits there. One was a previous funeral director. He didn't want to abandon his job. Another was an unclaimed set of remains that was found out in the hills. Several, and I do mean several years before I started there. The guy's family didn't have the money for his death, so they let the state take his remains and have him cremated. However, the family never came to claim him after the 2 years was up. I think at that point he just considered the funeral home his home. When I left there, his cremains were still there. Sadly, the ones we had there didn't want to move on. it's worth asking them if they're ready to find the light that will guide them to the next, but if they don't want to go just yet, they won't go. Next story. I would like to preface this with that while I believe in ghosts, I always try to find a logical explanation for anything strange that happens before saying ghost, poltergeist, or demon. I work in a hospital pharmacy on midnights, but at the hospital I work at, the pharmacy is right next to the hospital morgue. I've had some interesting experiences so far that I can't otherwise explain. We do have a ghost in the pharmacy that myself and the other person on midnights have named Henry. Don't know if that's his actual name, but he seems to respond to it. I say he because I've seen him out of the corner of my eye multiple times, and it's definitely a man, and I'm the only man on midnights in the pharmacy. Henry will make things fly off shelves and land places they shouldn't be able to if they just fell. He's banged on the plexiglass window that separates the main part of the pharmacy with the ivory room when myself and the other person were both outside of the ivory room. He threw a stapler at another person's face one evening. He's also made other banging noises, and when we investigate, nothing's fallen or knocked over, and we both hear them, so it's not just one person hearing things. Then the morgue itself has caused some issues. When they put a new body in the morgue some nights, depending on the manner of death, we hear random sounds and see something other than Henry moving about. We have all seen Henry enough out of the corner of our eyes to know what he looks like. He has a dark blue shirt and what appears to be black pants. Usually what we see when someone is newly in the morgue is less defined and harder to pick up the details on. Not sure if that's something to get the newly departed soul or the person themselves, spirit walking about. Sometimes it's the classic black mass, but doesn't really feel like it's angry or has malice. Next story. I've been working at a funeral home for about 3 years now, and I've only really experienced one thing I couldn't explain. It was maybe an hour and a half until the office closed, and I was the only one there. I was in the back office wasting time on the computer when I heard a muffled hello. I stood up instantly to look around. It sort of sounded like it was from the prep room, which is right next to the back office. But in my head I dismissed that immediately because it didn't make sense. I didn't hear either of our door chimes, so I figured I must have been out of it. I looked through the whole building and it was still just me. I was spooked. Sometimes I'll hear moving and creaking, but our building is pretty old, so I'm assuming it's just settling. Right? Next story. I work in a retirement home and my job often requires me to go to the basement with a cart full of dirty laundry. That means I have to use the elevator. I've done this 1,000 times already and never ever did I hear or see anything unusual. Not since I worked in a retirement home, amongst a lot of other rooms in the basement. There's also a temporary morgue which is located opposite of the elevator entrance. The morgue was probably used at some point in time, but as long as I've been working there, it was never even locked. Nobody used that room for anything. Today I was working as normal, going about my day, not feeling creeped out at all since it was the middle of the day and I've been to this basement too many times already and never had any reason to be scared of it. I went down to the basement, emptied the dirty laundry in the laundry room, and called the elevator down again since somebody had used it. I pressed the button, but the elevator wasn't coming down. Above me, though, the closed elevator doors, I could hear two of my coworkers speaking and holding the elevator from closing. The space in the elevator is very acoustic, and you can easily hear people on it from the basement all the way up to the third floor. At this point, I was getting a little bit pissed off because it was a particularly busy day and I didn't have any time to spare. So I started knocking on the elevator doors to let them know I was waiting for it. After a few knocks, it seemed to me they didn't register it as someone knocking for them to get off the elevator. So I decided to knock in a little melody rhythm to get their attention. Now, this is where something very weird happened. Maybe 5 seconds after that knock, I started hearing knocking back. It didn't have any particular pattern, and it sounded like literal knocking on a door. I first thought it was coming from my co-workers above, but quickly realized it was coming from behind me. I turned around to find the basement completely empty, and I couldn't quite figure out where it was coming from at first, until I came a few feet closer to the sound. It was coming from the abandoned morgue. I froze. 1,000 thoughts came rushing through my mind as I tried to somehow rationalize what I was hearing. I wanted to leave the cart behind and just sprint up the stairs and get the hell out of there when I heard the elevator finally coming down. It was the longest wait ever, but I finally got on and pressed the button to the third floor. I think I pressed that button at least 20 times before the doors closed and got me out of there. Maybe all of this can be very easily explained away with being an older building, sounds from the pipes or animals, etc., and being a pure coincidence with my knocking. But I never heard a building ever make a knocking sound on the door like that. Needless to say, it really creeped me out. Next story. I have a very good friend who worked in a retirement home where weird things would happen about once a month or so. Staff reported hearing chairs being dragged around in the dining hall when it was closed during non-meal hours. Strange electrical issues such as the elevator going up and down by itself or opening and closing on people out of the blue. It only happened 2 or 3 times in total. Disembodied voices could be heard very now and then, even laughing or crinkling that sound like a plastic grocery bag. After about a year working there, my friend started noticing familiarity where the weird instances taking place. She started to realize that certain residents who had recently passed away were the ones causing the chaos she was so terrified of. She stopped being scared once her favorite resident passed away. He had left an item that my friend wanted to keep. The whole family came and took his things away, and she was heartbroken that she didn't grab the item before the family came. The room was cleared out and clean, and 2 days later, she walked in and the item was right where she had expected it to be, but nobody else had seen it. And like I said, everything was cleared out and cleaned. Very friendly, comical-loving spirits hung around for a week or two before taking the leap into the light. Nothing malicious, but man, did it scare the hell out of her and the first few months she worked there. Next story. This reminds me of something that happened a few years back. I was at work and bored as hell, so I went to the abandoned side of our building. Think of our building as a very long rectangle, now separated into 4 connected building or rooms accessible only by inside doors. We used the building on the far left. Someone used the building next to the far left, but the next 2 large rooms were basically off limits. Old and decrepit and falling apart on that end. There just wasn't any reason to be over there. But as I entered the 3rd portion of the building, I stood there quietly letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. After a few minutes, I suddenly hear a light knocking from the door on the other side of the room. I should have been scared. Behind that door, it looked like Silent Hill. For some reason, I overlooked my fear and walked quietly to the door. Once again, a light knock, knock, knock. I grabbed the door handle and pulled the door open. There was a guy from a different division who, for whatever reason, came into our buildings and decided to go exploring, entering this door which locked behind him. I got onto him and told him nobody had been back here for months, and he was lucky as hell. I got so bored that day. In all, he had only been stuck for a half hour before I came along, but had I not, we would have found his remains many months later. Next story. So a couple of years ago, I worked at a hospital as security. Part of the security duties for the second shift was to lock all the doors downstairs in the basement of the hospital. The type of things down there range from offices, supply rooms, bathrooms, and the morgue. We would also have to check the refrigeration temp inside the morgue to make sure it was running properly, but that's not important. So one night I go down to the basement, which is basically a big rectangle, locked all the doors, and just as I was going to make a right to take the stairs up, I noticed someone walk out of the corner in what looked like blue scrubs, take about 5 steps into one of the doors I had just locked. They didn't open the door or anything, they just walked right in. As security, I couldn't just brush this off because recently we had people steal from the supply room, so I had to check it out, especially since it was after hours. As I walked up to the door, I immediately got goosebumps because this specific door was 1, an automatic locking door that can only be accessed by ID clearance. 2, I didn't see the individual pull out an ID, which you have to do to get in. You pull out your ID, scan, wait for the green light to pop up, and then open the door. I literally just saw someone take about 5 steps into the door like it was wide open, which it wasn't. This door automatically locks and closes itself. So I think to myself, well, if somehow someone accessed the door after hours, they aren't allowed to do this, so this might be the person that's stealing the stuff. If a nurse or someone needs to go to the supply room, they call security and security escorts them because of stealing incidents. So I pulled up my ID, scanned it, and opened the door. I walked in and saw nobody. Then I opened all the closet doors to confirm nobody was hiding, and then immediately got the hell out because I was 100% sure I just saw ghosts. Later that night, I got a call from the ER department to escort a nurse down to the supply room, and we made conversation as we went there. Now, what actually happened was I escorted her down to the basement, into the supply room, and told her what I saw. She then shuffled through some boxes in the supply room and pulled out the same exact looking light blue scrubs that I saw the ghost wearing, except they weren't scrubs. They were the blue gowns patients wear inside the hospital. So, what I saw that night was a patient ghost walking around the basement. After this experience, I definitely believe in ghosts and the afterlife. Till this day, I kick myself for not looking at the cameras that night. But my own two eyes don't lie.